My name is Professor Stefano Rossellini. I'm 61 years old, and for 37 years I've taught physics at Liceo Scientifico San Carlo Borromeo in Milan, one of the most prestigious secondary schools in northern Italy. I built my reputation as a rigorous, rational educator who was implacably skeptical of any religious expression that couldn't be explained by modern science. My students called me Professor Atou, Professor Atheist. I wore that nickname as a badge of honor. But in September 2005, when a 14-year-old boy named Carlo Acutis entered my classroom as a new student, a silent war began between my militant materialism and his unshakable faith. That war culminated on October 5th, 2006, exactly 7 days before Carlo's death, in what became the greatest mistake of my teaching career and the most devastating lesson in humility I have ever received. The punishment Carlo gave me was so subtle, so precise, that it took me 18 years to fully comprehend its depth and meaning, and it destroyed everything I thought I knew about intelligence, faith, and what it means to truly win an argument. I was born in 1963 in Milan, the only child of 2 university professors. My father taught philosophy at the Università Statale, my mother mathematics at Politecnico di Milano. I grew up in an environment of rigorous intellectual debate, where every claim had to be defended with evidence, where emotional appeals were dismissed as weakness, where reason was the only god we worshipped. My parents were both committed atheists, products of Italy's post-war intellectual culture that saw religious belief as a remnant of fascist-era manipulation and medieval superstition. Dinner table conversations in our home ranged from Marxist critiques of religious institutions to scientific materialism to the incompatibility between faith and reason. I absorbed this worldview completely. By the time I was 15, I could articulate sophisticated arguments against the existence of God, the irrationality of religious belief, and the historical crimes of the Catholic Church. I saw myself as enlightened, liberated from the mental prisons that constrained less educated people. I studied physics at Università Bocconi in the early 1980s, specializing in thermodynamics and quantum mechanics. I was drawn to physics specifically because it seemed to provide the clearest evidence that the universe operated according to impersonal natural laws without any need for divine intervention. Every equation I mastered felt like another nail in the coffin of supernatural explanation. In 1987, at age 24, I began teaching at Liceo Scientifico San Carlo Borromeo. The irony of teaching at a school named after a Catholic saint wasn't lost on me. In fact, I enjoyed it. I saw myself as an agent of enlightenment working behind enemy lines, using science education to liberate young minds from the religious indoctrination their families imposed. My pedagogical methods were deliberately provocative. I didn't just teach physics, I used physics as a weapon against faith. During units on cosmology, I would ridicule creationist theories. When explaining quantum mechanics, I emphasized how statistical probability eliminated any need for intelligent design. Teaching thermodynamics became an opportunity to demonstrate how universal entropy made concepts like eternity or afterlife absurd. I was proud of my approach. Over the years, I received letters from former students thanking me for freeing them from religious illusions, for teaching them to think critically, for showing them that science and faith were fundamentally incompatible. I married Lucia in 1990. She taught literature at another liceo, shared my atheist convictions, and together we raised 2 children, Alessandro and Francesca, in a rigorously secular household. We celebrated Christmas as a cultural tradition devoid of religious meaning. We visited churches only as historical monuments. We lived comfortable, intellectual, carefully rationalized lives. By 2005, at age 42, I had settled into a comfortable pattern. I was respected by colleagues, feared by religious students, admired by secular ones. I had published several articles in physics education journals. I served on curriculum committees. I mentored young teachers in how to promote scientific thinking in their classrooms. I thought I had everything figured out. And then Carlo Acutis walked into my classroom. September 15, 2005, first day of the new academic year. My third-year students filed into the physics classroom, a mix of familiar faces and a few transfers from other schools. Carlo was among the transfers, 14 years old, average height, dark hair, wearing the standard school uniform. Nothing about his physical appearance stood out. But the moment I called roll and he answered, "Presente," something about his voice, calm, clear, utterly assured, caught my attention. During that first class, as I laid out my expectations and teaching philosophy, I made my usual speech about scientific rigor and intellectual honesty. In this classroom, I said, as I had said for 18 years, we deal only with what can be observed, measured, and verified. We leave superstitions and unfounded beliefs at the door. Physics is the study of reality as it actually is, not as we wish it to be. Most students nodded, some looked uncomfortable. The Catholics always did during this speech, but Carlo simply smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a defensive smile, but a smile of such serene confidence that it immediately irritated me. Over the following weeks, I began to notice more about Carlo. He was brilliant, genuinely brilliant, not just well prepared. He asked sophisticated questions that revealed deep understanding of concepts we were studying. He could solve complex problems with elegant efficiency. He participated actively in discussions, demonstrating knowledge that exceeded what I expected from 14-year-olds. But what truly bothered me was his faith. He wasn't closeted about it the way some Catholic students were, embarrassed into silence by peer pressure or my sarcasm. Carlo wore a small cross on a chain around his neck, visible but not ostentatious. When other students made crude jokes about religion, he didn't laugh but also didn't protest. He simply existed in his faith with a confidence I found deeply threatening. Because here's what I had learned in 18 years of teaching. Truly intelligent students abandoned religious belief once they understood science properly. The students who maintained faith were either not bright enough to recognize the contradictions or were emotionally weak, clinging to comforting illusions because they couldn't handle reality's harshness. Carlo didn't fit either category. He was obviously intelligent, possibly the brightest student I'd had in years, and he showed no signs of emotional weakness or neediness. He was popular, well-adjusted, confident, without arrogance. This combination, intellectual brilliance plus authentic faith, violated my entire understanding of how the world worked. So I decided to fix him. In October 2005, I began targeting Carlo specifically with my anti-religious provocations. When discussing evolution, I would look directly at him while explaining how natural selection eliminated any need for divine creation. When teaching about the Big Bang, I would emphasize how physics explained cosmic origins without requiring a creator god. Carlo never took the bait. He participated enthusiastically in scientific discussions, demonstrating thorough understanding of evolutionary theory, cosmology, quantum mechanics. He never tried to inject religious explanations into scientific phenomena, but he also never showed any sign that science was shaking his faith. It was maddening. In December 2005, during a parent-teacher conference, Carlo's mother, Antonia, mentioned, with obvious pride, that her son spent hours each week working on a website documenting Eucharistic miracles. She showed me the site on her phone, professionally designed, meticulously researched, cataloging alleged supernatural events from around the world. I was appalled. A student with Carlo's talent in computer programming and web design was wasting his abilities on documenting medieval superstitions. This confirmed my worst suspicions. His family was exploiting his intelligence to promote religious propaganda. After that conference, I intensified my campaign. I made pointed comments during class. Acutis, with your programming skills, you could be developing software that actually benefits humanity, not cataloging fantasy stories that any educated person recognizes as psychological delusion. Or, it's tragic to see such a promising mind being wasted on documenting collective illusions that contradict everything we know about physics and biology. I said these things publicly in front of his classmates. I wanted to embarrass him, to make him defend his beliefs so I could systematically demolish them in front of an audience. I wanted other students to see the intellectual superiority of skepticism over faith. But Carlo never defended himself. He never argued. He simply continued smiling, continued participating brilliantly in class, continued treating me with inexplicable respect. His patience made me angrier. His serenity felt like mockery. His refusal to engage in theological debate seemed like intellectual cowardice. By spring 2006, my obsession with breaking Carlo's faith had become something colleagues noticed. During lunch, in the faculty room, another teacher, Professoressa Martelli, who taught history, pulled me aside. "Stefano, why do you target that Acutis boy so relentlessly? He's a model student. Respectful, hardworking, never causes problems." "That's exactly the problem," I replied. "He has genuine intellectual potential being corrupted by religious indoctrination. I'm trying to help him think critically." Martelli looked at me with something like pity. "Or perhaps you're uncomfortable that someone can be both scientifically literate and religiously faithful. That challenges your narrative, doesn't it?" I dismissed her concern. She didn't understand. She taught history, a soft subject where evidence was always incomplete and interpretation was subjective. Physics was different. Physics dealt with objective truth, with laws that couldn't be argued away. In April 2006, during a unit on thermodynamics, I was explaining entropy and the second law, how disorder in closed systems inevitably increases, how energy disperses, how the universe is running down toward heat death. "This," I said, looking directly at Carlo, "is why concepts like eternal life are scientifically absurd. The second law of thermodynamics applies to everything. Consciousness is an emergent property of organized matter. When that organization breaks down, which it inevitably must, consciousness ceases. There is no soul, no afterlife, no eternal anything, just entropy." Carlo raised his hand. "Professor Rossellini, does information obey the same entropy laws as physical matter?" It was a sophisticated question, touching on one of the most interesting debates in modern physics, whether information is subject to thermodynamic laws or represents something fundamentally different. I could have engaged with the question academically. We could have had a fascinating discussion about information theory, quantum mechanics, the black hole information paradox. Instead, I used it as an opportunity to humiliate him. "Acutis," I said with heavy sarcasm, making sure every student in the room was paying attention, "your question perfectly illustrates the kind of mental confusion that results from trying to reconcile serious science with primitive superstitions. You're clearly fishing for scientific loopholes to justify your childish beliefs about eternal souls and imaginary paradises." I continued for several more minutes, dissecting his intellectual inconsistencies in front of 28 classmates who admired him. I talked about religious brainwashing, about intelligent people who refuse to grow up intellectually, about how real science leaves no room for consoling fantasies about life after death. It was cruel. It was inappropriate. It was a complete violation of pedagogical ethics. Carlo listened in silence, his expression neutral. When I finally finished my tirade, he simply said, "Thank you for the explanation, Professor. I'll think carefully about your arguments." No sarcasm, no defensiveness, no retaliation, just that impossible serenity that made me want to scream. That was October 5th, 2006. 7 days later, Carlo Acutis was dead. On October 12th, 2006, I was teaching a morning class on wave mechanics when the school's vice principal, Dr. Colombo, appeared at my classroom door looking visibly shaken. "Professor Rossellini, may I speak with you in the corridor?" I excused myself, irritated by the interruption. Colombo's face was gray. "It's about Carlo Acutis," he said quietly. "He passed away this morning at San Gerardo Hospital, leukemia. It was very sudden. Diagnosed less than a week ago." The words didn't make sense. Carlo had been in my class the previous week. He had been healthy, active, brilliant as always. People didn't just die at 14 years old. That's impossible," I said stupidly. "I'm afraid it's true. The funeral will be Monday at Santa Maria Segreta. The school will be sending representatives. Given that he was in your class, you might want to attend." I walked back into my classroom in a daze. My students were chatting, unaware. I had to tell them that their classmate, a boy they had seen just days ago, healthy and smiling, was dead. The announcement hit the class like a physical blow. Several students began crying immediately. Others sat in shocked silence. Carlo had been popular, not in the shallow way some students are popular, but genuinely liked for his kindness, his intelligence, his authentic joy. I dismissed class early, couldn't continue teaching. couldn't process what I had just learned. That afternoon, alone in my apartment, I found myself thinking obsessively about my last interaction with Carlo, that public humiliation on October 5th, the sarcasm, the mockery, the deliberate cruelty. Had he known he was dying when I attacked him? Had he sat there already sick with leukemia while I ridiculed his faith and questioned his intelligence? The thought made me physically ill. Over the weekend, I learned more details about Carlo's illness and death. He had developed symptoms, extreme fatigue, bruising, just days after my public attack on him. The leukemia had progressed with shocking speed. He had died peacefully, surrounded by family, maintaining his characteristic serenity even in his final moments. I also learned that Carlo had been working on his Eucharistic Miracles website literally until the day he was hospitalized, that he had attended daily Mass throughout his short life, that he had been, by all accounts, an extraordinarily devout young man. All the things I had mocked him for, all the beliefs I had tried to shame him out of holding. The funeral was Monday, October 16th at Chiesa di Santa Maria Segreta in Milan. I attended, standing at the back, feeling like an imposter among genuinely grieving people who had actually known and loved Carlo. The church was packed. Students, teachers, family, friends. The casket, heartbreakingly small, sat at the front, covered in white flowers. The priest who celebrated the Mass, Padre Antonio Galli, spoke about Carlo's extraordinary faith, his love for the Eucharist, his joy even in suffering. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. Before his death, Carlo wrote letters to several important people in his life. With his family's permission, I'd like to share portions of what he wrote to his teachers. Padre Galli unfolded several handwritten pages. Carlo wrote these in the hospital, knowing he was dying. He wanted to thank the educators who had shaped his formation. He began reading letters to Carlo's Italian teacher, thanking her for fostering his love of language, to his history teacher for helping him understand the Church's complex role in civilization, to his mathematics teacher for showing him the beauty of logical systems, and then to Professor Stefano Rossellini, who taught me that science is one of the most beautiful ways to contemplate divine creation, even when he doesn't recognize his own mission of revealing God's glory through natural laws. Thank you for challenging me to understand more deeply how faith and reason perfectly complement each other. Your classes helped me realize that God is the greatest scientist in the universe. The words hit me like a physical blow. Several people turned to look at me. Apparently, my reaction was visible. Carlo had transformed months of sarcastic attacks and public humiliation into genuine gratitude. He had interpreted my hostile provocations as constructive intellectual challenge. He had found in my anti-Catholic rhetoric opportunities to deepen his own understanding of the compatibility between science and faith. How was that possible? After the funeral, I approached Carlo's mother, Antonia. She recognized me. We had met at that parent-teacher conference. Signora Acutis, I wanted to tell you how sorry I am for your loss. Carlo was an exceptional student. She embraced me, crying. Thank you, Professor. Carlo spoke about you often. He said your classes were among his favorites. This couldn't be true. Signora, I wasn't always kind to Carlo. I challenged his beliefs quite aggressively. Antonia pulled back, looking at me with red-rimmed eyes. I know, Carlo told me. He said you pushed him to think more rigorously about his faith, to make sure he understood why he believed what he believed, not just accepting it blindly. He was grateful for that. But I was trying to destroy his faith, I said, the words tumbling out. I wanted to prove religion was irrational, incompatible with science. She smiled sadly. I know. Carlo knew too. But he chose to receive your attacks as gifts, as opportunities to grow stronger. That was who he was. He transformed everything, even hostility, into something that brought him closer to God. I left that funeral in a state I can only describe as spiritual shock. Everything I thought I understood about intellectual victory, about the relationship between intelligence and faith, about my own moral and philosophical superiority, all of it was crumbling. In the weeks following Carlo's death, I couldn't stop thinking about that letter, about how he had won our silent war not through argument or debate, but through perfect charity, by refusing to see me as an enemy, by finding genuine value in my attacks, by praying for me while I mocked him. I began researching his Eucharistic Miracles project with genuine curiosity instead of dismissive contempt. What I found astounded me. The website was meticulous, academic, rigorous. Carlo had documented hundreds of alleged Eucharistic miracles, but he hadn't simply accepted them at face value. Each entry included historical context, scientific analysis where available, church investigations, skeptical perspectives. He had documented the Lanciano miracle, 8th century communion bread that had allegedly transformed into human heart tissue, which had been analyzed by multiple laboratories and confirmed to be actual myocardial tissue with no signs of decomposition, despite being over 1,000 years old. He had cataloged the Buenos Aires case from 1996, where Dr. Ricardo Castañón Gómez, an atheist cardiologist, had analyzed tissue from a communion host and concluded it was human heart muscle showing signs of severe trauma without being told the origin of the sample. When he finally learned it came from a communion wafer, he converted to Catholicism. Case after case, analyzed with scientific rigor, documented with scholarly precision. This wasn't medieval superstition. This was serious investigation of phenomena that challenged materialist assumptions. Carlo had been doing exactly what I claimed to value, following evidence wherever it led, maintaining intellectual honesty, refusing to dismiss data simply because it contradicted preferred conclusions, and I had mocked him for it. In December 2006, 2 months after Carlo's death, I attended a physics education conference in Rome. During a cocktail reception, I found myself in conversation with a colleague from Torino, Professor Benedetti, who taught quantum mechanics. I mentioned Carlo's case, a brilliant student who had maintained religious faith despite rigorous scientific education. I framed it as a pedagogical puzzle. How do we reach students whose intelligence is compromised by religious indoctrination? Benedetti looked at me with obvious distaste. Stefano, that's an incredibly arrogant framework. You're assuming faith and intelligence are incompatible based on what evidence? Based on the fact that science explains natural phenomena without requiring supernatural intervention, I replied. God is an unnecessary hypothesis. Perhaps, Benedetti said. But absence of necessity isn't proof of absence. Many brilliant scientists throughout history have been devout believers. Mendel, Lemaitre, Polkinghorne. Are you suggesting they were all intellectually compromised? I'm suggesting their scientific work succeeded despite their religious beliefs, not because of them. Benedetti shook his head. Listen to yourself. You've constructed an unfalsifiable position. Anyone who disagrees with you is by definition intellectually deficient. That's not scientific thinking. That's ideology. The conversation haunted me for weeks. Was my atheism actually scientific, or was it just another form of faith? Faith in materialism, in the non-existence of anything beyond physical reality. I had spent 18 years teaching physics as if it proved atheism. But did it? Or had I simply been using scientific authority to promote my own philosophical preferences? In January 2007, I made a decision that surprised even me. I started reading serious theology. Not apologetics or popular religious writing, but academic theology from reputable scholars. I read Thomas Aquinas, who had integrated Aristotelian physics with Christian theology. I read Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a paleontologist and Jesuit priest who saw evolution as the mechanism of divine creation. I read John Polkinghorne, a quantum physicist who became an Anglican priest and wrote extensively about science-faith compatibility. What I discovered shocked me. There was a rich intellectual tradition of thinkers who were both scientifically rigorous and religiously faithful. People who didn't see contradiction between natural laws and divine action, who understood God not as a competing explanation for physical phenomena, but as the ground of being that made physical phenomena possible. These weren't stupid people. They weren't intellectually lazy. They had simply asked different questions than I had. Not just, how does this work? But why is there something rather than nothing? And what is the source of the rational order we observe in nature? I didn't convert. I want to be clear about that. I didn't suddenly start believing in God or attending Mass. But I stopped being certain I was right about everything. And in losing that certainty, I began to understand the magnitude of what Carlo had done. He had defeated me not by arguing, not by defending his position, not by attacking mine. He had defeated me by absorbing my attacks with perfect love, by transforming my hostility into gratitude, by demonstrating a level of spiritual maturity that I, at 43 with a PhD and decades of teaching experience, couldn't begin to match. That was the punishment. Not revenge, not retaliation, just the devastating gentleness of genuine virtue confronting intellectual arrogance. In the spring semester of 2007, I changed how I taught physics. I stopped using science as a weapon against religion. I stopped making sarcastic comments about faith. I focused exclusively on teaching physics, the beauty of natural laws, the elegance of mathematical descriptions, the wonder of understanding how reality works at fundamental levels. My students noticed. Some were disappointed, the secular students who had enjoyed my anti-religious provocations. Others were relieved, the religious students who had endured my mockery. One student, a girl named Giulia, who had been Carlo's friend, stayed after class one day in March 2007. "Professor Rossellini, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "You've changed since Carlo died. Your classes are different. You don't attack religion anymore." "Why?" I considered how to answer. I realized I was confusing scientific explanation with philosophical conclusion. Physics tells us how the universe works. It doesn't necessarily tell us why there's a universe at all or what meaning that universe might have. Giulia nodded slowly. Carlo would have liked that answer. Would he? Yes. He used to say that science and faith ask different questions, so they can't really contradict each other. Science asks how, faith asks why, and who. He said attacking either one made you less complete as a thinker. 14 years old, and Carlo had understood something I was only beginning to grasp at 44. Giulia, did he ever talk about our conflicts, about how I challenged his beliefs? She smiled. He talked about you a lot. He said you were one of his favorite teachers. That seems impossible given how I treated him. He said you made him think harder than anyone else, that you forced him to really understand what he believed and why, instead of just accepting it because his parents taught him. He said that was a gift. I felt tears beginning to form, something that hadn't happened during a school day in my entire career. I tried to destroy his faith, Giulia. I know, he knew too, but Carlo didn't see enemies, Professor. He saw people God loved who didn't know they were loved yet. He prayed for you every day. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. While I had been publicly mocking him, systematically trying to humiliate him, treating him with open contempt, he had been praying for me daily. That was the punishment's final form, discovering that the person I had tried to defeat had loved me the entire time. Over the following years, my transformation continued gradually. I never became Catholic. I never started attending Mass or praying or believing in God in any traditional sense, but I stopped being militantly, confidently atheist. I adopted what I can only call intellectual humility, an acknowledgement that reality might contain depths and dimensions that scientific methods can't access, that consciousness might be more than emergent complexity, that meaning and value might be objective rather than subjective human constructions. I stopped seeing faith and reason as enemies and started seeing them as different approaches to truth, complementary rather than contradictory. My marriage to Lucia suffered. She saw my new openness to religious thought as intellectual betrayal, a slide toward the irrationality we had always defined ourselves against. We separated in 2009 and divorced in 2011. My children, Alessandro and Francesca, were confused by my change. They had been raised to see religion as superstition, and here was their father suggesting maybe it wasn't that simple. Professionally, some colleagues viewed me with suspicion. Had I gone soft? Others seemed relieved that I had stopped using my classroom as a platform for atheist evangelism. In 2020, when Carlo Acutis was beatified by Pope Francis, I watched the ceremony on television alone in my apartment. Blessed Carlo Acutis, officially recognized by the Catholic Church as having lived a life of heroic virtue, venerated as an example of modern sanctity. I had taught a saint, I had mocked and humiliated a saint. I had tried to destroy the faith of someone the Church now held up as a model for all believers. And that saint had defeated me through perfect love. During the beatification mass, they showed photographs of Carlo, his smile, his computer work, images from his short life. There was footage of his Eucharistic Miracles website, the project I had ridiculed as a waste of his talent. Thousands of people were now visiting that website, learning about phenomena that challenged materialist assumptions, discovering that faith and intellectual rigor weren't incompatible. Carlo had accomplished more in 15 years than I would accomplish in a lifetime, not through length of life, but through depth of love. I thought about the October day in 2006 when I had publicly humiliated him in front of his classmates, how he had listened patiently, thanked me, and then gone home to pray for my soul. I wept watching that beatification ceremony, wept for my own arrogance, wept for the years I had wasted being certain about things I didn't actually know, wept for the grace Carlo had shown me that I hadn't deserved and still didn't fully understand. I'm 61 years old now. I've been teaching physics for 37 years. I have maybe 5 to 10 years left before retirement. I still teach the same material, thermodynamics, quantum mechanics, relativity, all the beautiful mathematical descriptions of physical reality that fascinated me as a young student. But I teach differently. I present science as one way of knowing, not the only way. I encourage students to think deeply about the questions science can't answer. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is the universe mathematically ordered rather than chaotic? What is consciousness? What makes something morally right or wrong? I don't push religious answers to these questions, but I no longer mock students who find religious answers compelling. Several times each year, students ask me about Carlo Acutis. Word has spread that I taught the now blessed Carlo. They want to know what he was like. I tell them the truth, that he was brilliant, kind, unshakably peaceful, that he combined scientific literacy with deep faith in a way I once thought impossible, that he taught me more through his death than I taught him through all my classes. I don't tell them about our conflict, about my attempts to destroy his faith, about the public humiliation. That feels too personal, too shameful. But I've decided to tell this story now, 18 years later, because I think it needs to be told, because there are other teachers, like I was, using their classrooms as platforms for ideological warfare, confusing scientific authority with philosophical certainty, mocking students whose beliefs differ from their own. And there might be students like Carlo was, intelligent, faithful, navigating environments where their beliefs are treated as intellectual deficiency. To the teachers, I was wrong, profoundly, completely wrong. Not about the science. Thermodynamics still describes entropy, quantum mechanics still explains atomic behavior, but about the relationship between scientific knowledge and ultimate meaning. Science tells us how the physical world works. It doesn't tell us whether there's more to reality than the physical. It doesn't answer questions about purpose, meaning moral obligation, or whether consciousness survives death. When we use scientific authority to dismiss these questions as meaningless or to mock people who take them seriously, we're not being scientific. We're being ideological. To the students who face mockery for your beliefs, Carlo's strategy was perfect. He didn't argue, he didn't defend, he didn't attack back. He absorbed hostility with love, transformed criticism into opportunity for growth, and maintained peace in the face of deliberate provocation. That approach didn't just preserve his faith, it defeated his opponent more completely than any argument could have. I lost our silent war not because my logic was flawed or my science was wrong, but because I was operating in a completely different framework than Carlo. I was fighting to win an argument. He was fighting to love an enemy. There's no victory against that. Perfect love conquers everything, including the intellectual arrogance of physics professors who think they have reality figured out. Blessed Carlo Acutis, pray for teachers who confuse knowledge with wisdom. Pray for students whose faith is under attack in educational environments. Pray for people like I was, so certain of their own rightness that they can't see the limitations of their certainty. And pray especially for all of us who need to learn that defeating someone in argument is worthless compared to loving them in truth. I'm still not Catholic. I still don't pray. I still don't know if God exists. But I know Carlo existed. I know his love was real. I know he achieved something in 15 years that I haven't achieved in 61. And I know that if I live to be 100, I will never stop being grateful that he chose to respond to my cruelty with charity, to my mockery with prayer, to my attempts to destroy his faith with perfect forgiveness. Some defeats are so complete that you spend the rest of your life understanding their depth. This is mine.